There are 521 facts in Elden Ring that the game never directly explains to you, all hidden inside item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling, and this video is going to walk you through every single one of them tonight. So I put this video together over several months of combing through item descriptions, replaying the game on multiple characters, reading through community research, and cross-referencing everything I could find. The reason I made it is simple. Elden Ring is one of those games that rewards obsession, and I wanted a resource that actually treats the lore seriously without rushing through it. One specific choice I made when assembling this was to lead with the cosmology and the ancient history of the world before moving into the characters and events most players encounter. That order made the most sense to me, because so much of what the demigods do only becomes meaningful once you understand the world they were born into. Some things I excluded entirely, like the more speculative fan theories that have no real grounding in the text. Everything you are about to hear is rooted in something the game actually tells you, even if it tells you quietly. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Fact 1. The world of Elden Ring exists within a cosmological framework that is far older than the Erd tree, far older than Queen Marika, and far older than the Elden Ring itself. The game suggests that before any of the familiar landmarks of the lands between existed, there was something called the Crucible. The Crucible is described in the lore as the primordial concept of life itself, a sort of raw and undifferentiated wellspring from which all living things were originally drawn. It was not ordered, not clean, and not divine in any recognizable sense. It was simply life in its most elemental form, chaotic and overflowing with potential. Understanding the Crucible is important because so much of what comes later, the Erd tree, the Order, the golden lineage, can be read as a deliberate effort to move away from the Crucible and replace it with something more controlled. Fact 2. The Crucible was not just a metaphysical concept. It had a physical presence in the world, and traces of it still appear in creatures and beings who carry what the game calls Crucible aspects. These aspects manifest as things like tails, feathers, scales, and other features that suggest an ancient, primordial form of life that predates the current order. The Crucible Knight enemies in the game are explicitly keepers of this ancient power. Their incantations draw directly from the Crucible, and their armour carries the faint glow of that primordial energy. The fact that the game frames Crucible aspects as something between a mark of nobility and a mark of shame points toward an interesting tension in the world's history. At some point something shifted, and what was once revered became taboo. Fact 3. Before the Erd tree grew, the lands between was populated by beings that do not fit neatly into any of the game's current factions. The ancient dragons are among the oldest of these. The lore suggests that the dragons predated the dominance of the Erd tree by an enormous margin. Their power came not from any outer god, but from something intrinsic to their nature. The ancient dragons in particular, the ones with stone-coloured scales and ancient names, are described as beings who existed in an era when the concept of the Elden Ring did not yet apply to the world. They governed by a different law entirely. Fact 4. The ancient dragons appear to have lived in a kind of civilization around what is now known as Farum Azula. The crumbling Farum Azula that players visit is described as a city that was not built by humans. It is suspended in the sky, slowly being destroyed by a storm that has persisted for an unknown amount of time. The lore suggests that this location predates the current age by a vast span of time, and that the dragons who once lived there were not simply wild animals. They had a structured society, they had warriors, and they had something approaching a shared culture. What caused their civilization to end is not stated directly, but the evidence points toward the arrival of the greater will and the changes it brought. Fact 5. The greater will is one of the most important and least understood entities in the game's cosmology. It is described as an outer god, a being of enormous power that exists outside the world and exerts influence upon it from afar. The greater will does not act directly. Instead, it sends fragments of itself, its will made manifest, into the world to shape events according to its agenda. The Elden Ring is itself one of these manifestations. The lore suggests that the greater will's motivations are not benevolent in any human sense. It is not caring for the lands between the way a parent cares for a child. It is using the lands between the way a farmer uses a field. Fact 6. The two fingers are the primary intermediaries between the greater will and the inhabitants of the lands between. They appear as large, two-fingered appendages housed in specific locations throughout the world. They communicate through finger readers, individuals who have the ability to interpret their movements and translate them into something resembling language. The three fingers are a separate entity, one that the game strongly implies is connected to the frenzied flame, which is essentially the greater will's opposition. The relationship between the two fingers and the three fingers is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the game's cosmology. Fact 7. The Elden Ring itself is not a physical ring in the conventional sense. It is better described as a metaphysical framework, a set of interlocking runes that together define the fundamental laws of existence in the lands between. Life, death, order, the nature of souls, the passage of time, the behaviour of grace, all of these things are governed by the Elden Ring. When the Elden Ring was shattered, it was not just a political crisis, it was an ontological one. The rules of existence in the lands between were broken in a literal sense, and the chaos that followed, everything from the spreading scarlet rot to the madness spreading through certain regions, is a downstream consequence of that shattering. Fact 8. Queen Marika the Eternal is simultaneously the most important figure in the game's recent history, and one of the most ambiguous. She is described as a god, and in a functional sense, she is one. She holds the Elden Ring within herself, acting as its vessel, and through that power she rules the lands between. But the game's lore suggests strongly that Marika was not born a god. She was born a human, or at least something very close to human, and was elevated to her divine status by the greater will. This distinction matters because it means Marika's relationship to her own power is complicated by the fact that it was granted rather than inherent. Fact 9. Before Marika became a god, she appears to have been a member of the Numen, a people described as originating from outside the lands between. The Numen are rare in the current era of the game, and the lore treats them as something of an anomaly. Marika's origins among this people suggest that the greater will specifically chose someone from outside the established order of the lands between to serve as its vessel. One possible reading of this is that an outsider would have fewer pre-existing loyalties, making them a more controllable instrument of the greater will's agenda. Fact 10. The Erd Tree did not always exist in the form players encounter it. The lore suggests that the Erd Tree grew from a seed of the greater will, planted in the lands between as part of a deliberate process. The tree's golden light, the grace it radiates, and the system of death and rebirth it governs are all functions of the greater will operating through this physical anchor. The Erd Tree is not simply a tree, it is infrastructure. It is the physical mechanism through which the greater will maintains its hold on the world. Fact 11. The crucible and the Erd Tree are in fundamental tension with each other. The crucible represents primordial, undirected life. The Erd Tree represents ordered, directed, controlled life that serves the greater will's agenda. The fact that crucible aspects became markers of shame in Erd Tree-dominated culture suggests that the rise of the Erd Tree involved a suppression of the old ways. Those who carried visible signs of the crucible were marginalized, which points toward a deliberate cultural shift rather than a natural evolution. Fact 12. The Omen are one of the clearest examples of the crucible's persistence in the face of Erdtree suppression. Omen are humans who are born with crucible aspects, manifesting as horns, tails, and other growths. In the society governed by Marika and the Erdtree, Omen are treated as cursed, and the standard practice is to sever their horns and cast them into the sewers beneath Leyndell. This is remarkable because the game's lore strongly implies that Omen were once considered sacred. There is a reading that the Omen's horns are not a curse but a mark of genuine power that the Erdtree's order wanted removed from circulation. Fact 13. Morgott and Mog are twin Omen princes, the secret sons of Marika and Godfrey. Their existence is treated as deeply shameful in the world of the game, and they were cast into the sewers beneath Leyndell as infants, in keeping with Omen customs. The fact that Marika, herself a god, and the ruler of the lands between, gave birth to Omen children, and then allowed them to be treated according to standard custom, says something uncomfortable about the nature of the order she presided over. It suggests either that she was bound by that order in ways that limited her own agency, or that she genuinely held the belief she enacted. Fact 14. Godfrey was the first Elden Lord, the warrior king chosen by Marika to serve as her consort, and the military arm of the Erdtree's expansion. His story is one of the more poignant in the game, because it ends not with a dramatic betrayal or a villain's turn, but with something quieter and more interesting. Godfrey was stripped of his grace, that connection to the greater will that the Erdtree provides, and exiled from the lands between. The reason given is that Marika wanted to temper the Elden Ring, a cryptic statement that becomes clearer when you understand what came next. Fact 15. When Godfrey was exiled, he became the first Tarnished. This is a crucial piece of history. The Tarnished are not a random category of outcast. They are specifically people who were once connected to grace and then had that connection severed, causing them to be expelled from the lands between. After Godfrey's exile, his followers, the warriors who fought alongside him in the wars that expanded Marika's domain, also became tarnished. They wandered outside the lands between for generations, sustained by a faint remnant of grace that kept them from dying in the conventional sense. Fact 16. The wars that Godfrey fought on Marika's behalf were not simple conquests. Each of them had specific significance, and the enemies he defeated were not random. One of the most important was the war against the giants. The fell god of the fire giants, the entity worshipped by the giant people of the mountaintops of the giants, was connected to the rune of death. The giants kept the rune of death within their flame, and Marika wanted it. The war against the giants was, at least in part, a theological operation designed to seize control of death itself. Fact 17. The fire giants are among the most tragic figures in the game's history. Their entire civilization was destroyed, their god was sealed, and the survivors were mutilated, their legs removed, and set to guard the flame that had been taken from them. The last fire giant in the game, the boss player's encounter at the mountaintops, is the descendant of those survivors. He has been alive, alone, guarding a flame he was specifically kept alive to maintain for an incalculable amount of time. His combat behaviour and the way he uses his own body as a weapon while dragging his sealed-off lower body behind him suggests something deeply broken about his existence. Fact 18. Marika's seizure of the rune of death from the giants was not simply an act of conquest. It was an act of ontological engineering. By removing the rune of death from the Elden Ring and hiding it away, Marika effectively removed the concept of true death from the world. After this point, the inhabitants of the lands between could no longer die in the permanent sense. Instead, they would be drawn back to the Erd tree, where their souls would be recycled into new life. This sounds beneficial, but the law suggests it created enormous problems over time as the world became increasingly crowded with the old and the mad. Fact 19. Destined death is the term the game uses for the natural death that Marika suppressed. It is governed by the rune of death, and the figure most closely associated with it is Malekith, the Black Blade. Malekith is Marika's shadow, her hidden half-brother by some readings, given the power to guard the rune of death and prevent it from being used to end lives in the way that natural death once would have. Malekith's boss fight is one of the most lore-significant encounters in the game, because defeating him and burning the Erd tree restores the rune of death to the world, with devastating consequences. Fact 20. Ranni the Witch performed the act that fractured everything. On a night called the Night of Black Knives, she used a fragment of the rune of death to kill Godwyn the Golden, the first demigod to be touched by destined death. Ranni herself also died that night, or rather her flesh died. She transferred her soul into a doll, a constructed body that would allow her to continue existing outside the purview of the Erd tree and outside the influence of the greater will. The Night of Black Knives is the inciting event for almost everything in the game's plot. Fact 21. Godwyn the Golden was Marika's first son and is described as one of the most beloved figures in the entire Lands Between. His death was not straightforward. The Black Knife assassins who carried out the Night of Black Knives killed only his soul, leaving his body alive. This created something unprecedented. Godwyn became a being without a soul, his body continuing to exist, and eventually growing, spreading across the ground beneath Leyndell in a vast and alien network of corrupted flesh. This state is called the death of the soul, and it is treated in the lore as something profoundly wrong, a kind of existence that should not be possible. Fact 22. The corruption spreading beneath Leyndell, the roots, the pale humanoid faces embedded in the earth, the entity called the Prince of Death, all of this is Godwyn. His body denied death but denied the soul that would make him truly alive, simply expanded. Some lore researchers suggest that Godwyn's condition represents a kind of third state between life and death, and that this state has its own logic and its own desires. The small creatures called Deathroot are connected to Godwyn, and the spreading of Deathroot throughout the world suggests that his influence is not contained to Leyndell. Fact 23. The Black Knife assassins were all women. This is not incidental. The lore suggests that the Black Knife Covenant was composed entirely of Numen women, people who shared Marika's own heritage. This points toward a conspiracy that was at least partly internal, connected to Marika's own lineage, and possibly even to Marika herself. The question of whether Marika ordered or at minimum permitted the Night of Black Knives is one of the most debated in the game's fandom, and the evidence genuinely supports multiple interpretations. Fact 24. Ranni's motive for the Night of Black Knives is complex and not fully explained in the game. The most widely supported reading is that Ranni wanted to free herself from the fate that the Two Fingers had ordained for her, which was to become the next vessel of the Elden Ring, essentially replacing Marika. Ranni did not want to be a vessel for the Greater Will's agenda. The Night of Black Knives was her way of dying before her appointed role could be imposed on her, though dying in a way that left her soul intact and free. Her entire questline is about finding an alternative order, one not governed by the Greater Will at all. Fact 25. The Elden Ring shattering happened after the Night of Black Knives, and the connection between the two events is important. The lore suggests that Marika herself shattered the Elden Ring. Why she did this is one of the central mysteries of the game. One reading is grief, she lost her son Godwyn. Another reading is defiance. She had spent her existence as a vessel for the Greater Will, and the Night of Black Knives, whatever her involvement, may have been the breaking point of that relationship. A third reading is strategy, that she shattered the ring deliberately to set in motion events that would eventually lead to a new order. Fact 26. When the Elden Ring shattered, its pieces became the great runes. Each great rune was taken by one of the demigods, and the conflict over these runes became known as the Shattering. The Shattering was a civil war among Marika's children and extended family, fought across the entire lands between, with catastrophic consequences. The game's present day is set after the Shattering, in a world that has not recovered from it. The landscape of the lands between, with its ruined cities, its scarred regions, and its populations of mad hollows, is largely a product of what the Shattering did to the world. Fact 27. Godfrey, now called Huaralu in his primal warrior identity, was summoned back to the lands between when the Tarnished began returning. The lore suggests that when the Shattering happened, Marika's grace began calling to the Tarnished, who had been wandering outside the world for generations, guiding them back. Godfrey himself was not passively waiting. He came back of his own accord, apparently driven by some instinct or ambition, and now sits waiting in Lane Dell as the final guardian of the Erd Tree. His boss fight involves him discarding the persona of Godfrey entirely to fight as Huaralu, the warrior he was before he became a lord. Fact 28. Radagon of the Golden Order is one of the most strikingly strange figures in the entire game. He was a great warrior and champion of the Erd Tree, who became Marika's second consort after Godfrey's exile. But the game reveals, in one of its most remarkable lore moments, that Radagon and Marika are the same person. The exact nature of this relationship is debated. One reading is that Radagon was always a part of Marika, a separate identity she projected. Another is that they were separate and became fused. The most interesting detail is that they apparently disagreed with each other, and that this internal conflict had real consequences for the world. Fact 29. Radagon tried to repair the Elden Ring after Marika shattered it. This is shown in the game through environmental details and item descriptions. The fact that the same being who shattered the ring also tried to repair it is exactly the kind of contradiction that defines Marika's character throughout the lore. She is repeatedly a figure of enormous power, making decisions that appear to work against each other. And the reading that makes the most sense of this is that her dual nature with Radagon meant she was literally of two minds about almost everything. Fact 30. The Golden Order is the religious and political framework through which Marika governed the lands between. It is built around the worship of the Erd Tree and the adherence to the Greater Will's definition of what is good and ordered. The Golden Order is not presented as straightforwardly evil, but the lore consistently reveals the violence and suppression that underpinned it. The Crucible being shamed, the Omen being cast out, the dragons being subjugated, the giants being nearly exterminated, all of these are consequences of the Golden Order's expansion and its intolerance of anything that predated or existed outside its framework. Fact 31. Goldmask is one of the most unusual NPCs in the game, a figure who barely speaks and communicates only through posture and gesture. He is a radical believer in the Golden Order, but his belief is not blind. He spends the game trying to reason out the perfect form of the Golden Order through pure logic, without any recourse to faith. His conclusion, when he reaches it, is genuinely surprising, and the ending associated with his questline involves imposing a revised Golden Order that removes the need for a living god entirely. Whether this is presented as a good or bad outcome is deliberately left ambiguous. Fact 32. The Academy of Raya Lucaria is the centre of the game's sorcery tradition, and its history is more politically complex than it first appears. The Academy was founded as an institution dedicated to the study of the glintstone and the cosmic powers associated with it, specifically the power of the primeval current, which is described as the original sorcery of the stars. The Academy maintained a degree of independence from the Golden Order for a long time, which put it in tension with Leyndell. The relationship between glintstone sorcery and the faith traditions of the Erd Tree is one of genuine antagonism. Fact 33. Glintstone sorcery is rooted in the belief that the stars are not simply distant lights, but thinking entities with their own desires and histories. The lore of the Academy frames sorcery as a process of aligning one's mind with the primeval current, the flow of cosmic thought that connects all stars. This is philosophically very different from the Erd Tree's approach, which derives power from the greater will through faith and devotion. The Academy's tradition treats the cosmos as an intellectual system to be studied and understood. The Erd Tree's tradition treats the greater will as an authority to be obeyed. Fact 34. Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, was the head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria before her marriage to Radagon. Their union was politically significant, representing a temporary alliance between the Academy and the Golden Order. When Radagon left Renala to become Marika's consort, the political alliance collapsed. Renala herself appears to have broken down emotionally, retreating into a state of near catatonia in the library of the Academy, tended to by scholars who became devoted to her in a way that borders on worship. Her boss fight is one of the most visually inventive in the game, and her lore is genuinely sad. Fact 35. Renala's obsession after Radagon left her became rebirth. She possesses a great rune, not a conventional shard of the Elden Ring, but the Amber Egg, which contains the power to rewrite the essence of living things. She's been attempting to rebirth Radagon from the memory of him that she holds, creating imperfect copies. The scholars who serve her, who have become essentially her children in a psychological sense, are described as carrying pieces of her Amber Egg close to them, which is why they can revive her during her boss fight's first phase. The pathos of her situation is almost entirely in the background details. Fact 36. The children Renala bore with Radagon became three of the most important demigods in the game. Radan, Rykard and Ranni are all Renala and Radagon's children. Each of them represents a different response to the world they were born into, and each of their storylines reflects something about the tension between the Academy's tradition and the Golden Order's authority. Radan studied gravity sorcery, Rykard studied serpent power, and eventually fed himself to the god-devouring serpent. Ranni plotted the Night of Black Knives and escaped the fate the Two Fingers had prepared for her. Fact 37. Radan is one of the most beloved characters in the game among the fandom, largely because the details of his life and his downfall are so well constructed. He was one of the mightiest warriors in the Lands Between, capable of fighting entire armies alone. He studied under the centaur Jeren in Celia Town of Sorcery, learning gravity sorcery specifically so that he could hold the stars still. This is not a metaphor. The lore suggests that at some point the movement of the stars would have had a catastrophic effect on the Lands Between, and Radan halted that movement through sheer magical force. Fact 38. The reason Radan halted the stars is directly connected to Ranni's plan. The stars that Radan held in place were relevant to Ranni's intended destiny, and by holding them still, Radan was inadvertently preventing Ranni's plan from proceeding. Whether Radan knew this and was doing it deliberately, or whether he simply identified the movement of the stars as dangerous and responded to that danger without knowing its full context, is left open. The game leans toward the reading that Radan was acting instinctively, holding back a threat he perceived without necessarily understanding its full nature. Fact 39. The scarlet rot that consumed Radan came from Malenia. Their battle at Aeonia Swamp is described in the lore as one of the most devastating events of the Shattering. Malenia unleashed the scarlet rot on herself and on Radan when she could not defeat him through conventional combat, and the result was that both of them effectively stopped the battle without either winning. Radahn was left alive, but hollowed out by the rot, no longer capable of rational thought, reduced to eating the corpses of those who had died at the battle site. The entire region of Caelid is the aftermath of that single event. Fact 40. Malenia's connection to the Scarlet Rot is not a curse she was given by an enemy. She was born with it. The lore describes her as a child of the Empyrean, one of a small number of beings who could potentially become the next vessel of the Elden Ring. But she was born as a vessel for something else as well. The Scarlet Rot, which the game links to an outer god known as the Rot Goddess or the God of Rot. Malenia's entire existence has been a struggle to contain the Scarlet Rot within herself, a battle she has been losing her whole life. Fact 41. Malenia's armour and her general presentation are all built around the idea of a person who has lost so much to her condition that what remains is almost entirely will. She lost her arm and her leg to the rot at different points in her history. She replaced them with prosthetics. She refused to be diminished by her losses. The lore suggests that the reason she is so terrifying in combat is not simply that she is skilled, though she clearly is, but that she has an absolute refusal to stop that borders on something beyond ordinary courage. Fact 42. The Halig tree was built by Malenia's brother Miquella, and it was built specifically for Malenia. Miquella was the other Empyrean child of Marika, and he was, by the evidence of the lore, genuinely devoted to his twin sister. He created the Halig tree as a place where Malenia could be cured of her rot, a sacred space that operated under a different set of rules than the Eard tree, one that might allow the scarlet rot to be cleansed rather than simply contained. The fact that this project ultimately failed, or at least was never completed in the way Miquella intended, is one of the game's sadder background stories. Fact 43. Miquella is never fought directly in the base game, but his presence is felt throughout. He was taken by Mog, the Lord of Blood, and is contained within a cocoon in the palace area of Mogwyn. Mog's apparent devotion to Miquella is one of the stranger details in the game's lore, particularly given that Miquella is described as being in a state of self-imposed slumber inside the cocoon, attempting to shed his flesh and become a true god through a process that required him to give up all that he loved. The Shadowlands DLC expands enormously on Miquella's story. Fact 44. In the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, players follow Miquella's footsteps into a hidden land called the Land of Shadow. This region was obscured and separated from the lands between through Marika's own actions. The Land of Shadow is where Marika herself comes from, her original homeland, and it is also the place where she committed acts she later suppressed and tried to forget. Miquella went to the Land of Shadow to perform a ritual that would make him a god capable of challenging the greater will, but the path he took to get there involved sacrifices that changed him in ways that are disturbing when you understand them fully. Fact 45. The Finger Maiden. Thiolier is one of the NPCs introduced in the DLC who illuminates a particularly dark aspect of Miquella's story. She was devoted to Miquella, and through her dialogue and the item descriptions associated with her questline, the game makes clear that Miquella's transformation toward godhood involved him deliberately stripping himself of his capacity for love and empathy. The same Miquella who built the Halig tree for his sister became in the Land of Shadow something colder and more calculating. One reading of this is that becoming a god required becoming something inhuman, and Miquella accepted that cost. Fact 46. Messmer the Impaler is perhaps the most significant new character introduced in the DLC. He is the Lord of the Land of Shadow, the figure who enforces Marika's suppression of its history. The lore reveals that Messmer is Marika's son, one she had before the events of the main game, and that she sent him to the Land of Shadow specifically to destroy a people called the Hornsent and to eradicate a serpent cult that operated there. Messmer fulfilled this mission with extreme violence and was then effectively imprisoned in the Land of Shadow, kept in place by a seal that prevented him from returning to the lands between. Fact 47. The Hornsent are a people whose entire history was erased from the records of the lands between. They worshipped a different order, connected to the concept of mending the Elden Ring in a specific way. Their culture was sophisticated and old, predating much of what the Golden Order built. The fact that Marika sent Messmer to destroy them, and then suppressed the evidence of both their existence and his campaign against them, suggests that the history of the lands between is significantly more violent and morally compromised than the Golden Order's official narrative presents it. Fact 48. Morg, Lord of Blood, is Morgoth's twin brother, and one of the most lavishly designed bosses in the game. His domain, Mogwyn Palace, is a subterranean, blood-soaked world that he rules as the lord of an entirely separate dynasty. Mog worships the Formless Mother, an outer god associated with blood and wounds. His power comes from this god, and his ambitions are enormous. He wants to establish a dynasty with Miquella as his consort god, essentially creating a rival divine order to the Erdtree. Whether the Formless Mother is a benevolent entity or simply another manipulative outer god using a willing vessel is unclear, but the evidence leans toward the latter. Fact 49. Morgoth, who appears to players first as Margit the Fell Omen and later as the true boss of Leyndell, is genuinely one of the more sympathetic figures in the game when you understand his full story. He spent his entire life hating himself for being an omen, while simultaneously devoting himself absolutely to protecting the Erdtree and the order that had cast him out. He built an elaborate disguise in Margit specifically to test and cull Tarnished, who were not strong enough to face what lay ahead. He did this not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of service to an institution that had never considered him worthy of belonging to it. Fact 50. Roykard, Lord of Blasphemy, chose a path that is horrifying by the standards of the Golden Order, and arguably understandable by almost any other metric. He was so disgusted by the Golden Order and its systems of control that he voluntarily fed himself to the god-devouring serpent, an ancient entity housed within Mount Gelmir's volcano. In doing this, he believed he was consuming the power of a god, gaining the kind of immortality that would let him outlast the order he despised. The result was that he and the serpent merged, with Roykard's consciousness still present, but gradually being consumed in turn. The boss fight reflects this, with Roykard speaking through the serpent's body in a way that sounds both triumphant and deeply wrong. Fact 51. The Volcano Manor is the cult that formed around Roykard's power, and it is staffed by assassins who hunt down champions of the Erdtree. Their questline asks players to participate in these assassinations, and the targets they are given are all connected to the Golden Order in some way. The manor is presented as sinister, and it clearly is, but the targets of its assassinations are not always sympathetic figures. The questline is one of the more morally murky in the game, and it ends with the player being asked to kill Roykard himself. Fact 52. Godric the Grafted is Godfrey's distant descendant, and one of the weakest of the demigods by most measures. Yet he is among the most desperate, and ultimately one of the more pathetic. His signature ability is grafting, taking limbs from other bodies and attaching them to himself to accumulate power. His castle at Stormvale is covered in the results of this process. Bodies fused into walls, limbs attached to guardians. Godric is described as having been bullied and dismissed by the other demigods before the shattering. His grafting is less a coherent power strategy and more the expression of a profound inadequacy dressed up in violence. Fact 53. The Stormhawks who serve Godric are worthy of attention. The Stormhawk King, whose ashes appear in the game as a spirit summon, was Godfrey's personal war eagle, a creature of enormous power and loyalty. The fact that descendants of this lineage now serve Godric, a figure who is almost a parody of what Godfrey represented, is quietly devastating. It suggests a dynasty in complete decline, with the symbols of past greatness being used to legitimize a present that cannot come close to matching them. Fact 54. The Fell Omen, which is Margit's title when he first appears, is a mask that Morgott wears in the same way that many characters in the game wear constructed identities. But there is something specific about the Fell Omen. The golden weapons Morgott conjures in his fight, the spectral daggers and hammers, are not the weapons of an omen. They are closer to the weapons of grace, the golden tools of the Erd tree. Morgott is fighting players with the power of the very tradition that rejected him. He is, in every sense, the Erd tree's most devoted defender and its most rejected child simultaneously. Fact 55. The demi-human civilization that players encounter throughout the game, particularly in Liurnia, is described in lore as an ancient people who predate the current order. They are often treated as monsters or bandits by the world's current inhabitants, but item descriptions suggest they had their own culture, their own crafts, and their own history before the Erdtree's expansion marginalized them. Their chief figures, the large demi-human queens, appear to have had genuine magical knowledge. The fact that they are presented almost entirely as enemies is itself a commentary on how the Erdtree's order has defined who counts as civilized. Fact 56. The falling star beasts are among the more unusual creatures in the game, appearing as crustacean-like entities that have fallen from the stars. Their lore describes them as parasites that originated in the cosmos and whose fall to the earth is connected to the broader system of glintstone and stellar magic. The full-grown falling star beast in Mount Gelmir has been embedded in the volcano for so long that it has become part of the landscape. Its continued presence near Rykard's domain is probably not coincidental, and some lore researchers have suggested connections between the ancient serpent cult and star-connected entities. Fact 57. Farum Azula's position in the sky is not natural. The lore suggests that this ancient dragon civilization was elevated from the earth at some point, possibly connected to the storm that now surrounds it. The beastmen who inhabit the ruins are descendants of the ancient civilizations that coexisted with the dragons, and their faith, centered on Malekith, speaks to a tradition that predates the Erd tree. The Erd tree's grace does not reach into Farum Azula. It is one of the few places in the game that exists genuinely outside the Erd tree's influence. Fact 58. Dragon Lord Placidusax is probably the most ancient boss in the game and is presented as the Elden Lord of the Age before Marika. He governed the world under a different god, a god who eventually abandoned the world and whose name is never given. The fact that Placidusax still waits in Farum Azula, sleeping in the position of someone expecting their god to return, is one of the most poignant details in the entire game. He has been waiting for an incalculable amount of time for a god that is never coming back. His fight involves two heads, the suggestion being that he originally had more. Fact 59. The deathbird creatures that roam the world at night are connected to a tradition of death that predates the Erdtree system. They are described as birds that carry the souls of the dead, and their connection to a death goddess associated with the night suggests they are remnants of a system of death that operated before Marika removed the rune of death. The items you get from killing them or their associated puzzles often relate to cold or moon imagery, pointing toward a tradition aligned with neither the greater will nor the frenzied flame. Fact 60. The Tibia Mariner enemies who float above small boats and summon skeletal armies are described as guiding the dead to the land of the dead. This function suggests that before the Erdtree system of soul recycling was established, there was a different cosmological arrangement for what happened after death, one that involved these figures guiding souls to a specific destination. The Tibia Mariners' continued presence in the world, despite being clearly ancient, suggests that the old system's infrastructure persists even when the system itself has been partially dismantled. Fact 61. Knights Cavalry are described as hunting knights, who served a death goddess associated with the night. Their patrol routes only activate at night. They ride black horses with glowing eyes, and they carry weapons associated with cold and moonlight. Their existence alongside the Deathbird suggests a whole tradition of night and death that operated outside the Erdtree's domain. The Knight's cavalry boss drops are often connected to cold sorcery or moonlight, reinforcing this association. Fact 62. The Round Table Hold is a fascinating location that appears to exist outside of the normal geography of the lands between. It floats in some kind of liminal space, accessible through grace, but not through physical travel. The NPCs who gather there are all connected to the Tarnished's quest in various ways, and the hold functions as a kind of neutral ground where different factions can coexist. The fact that it exists outside the normal world suggests it was deliberately constructed or set aside for exactly this purpose, possibly by Marika before the Shattering. Fact 63. Naya, the finger reader who serves at the Round Table Hold, is one of the more quietly important NPCs in the game. She can translate the great runes obtained from boss encounters, and she trades them for blessings that upgrade your character's core stats. But her dialogue, particularly regarding the great runes and the Tarnished's role, contains interesting implications about who is truly in control of the quest. She's a servant of the Two Fingers, and therefore of the greater will, and her helpfulness does not obscure that she has an agenda that may not align with the player's interests. Fact 64. Hugh is the blacksmith trapped in the Round Table Hold, unable to leave due to a curse Marika placed on him. The lore reveals that Hugh was asked by Marika to forge a weapon capable of killing a god. He has been working on this task ever since, unable to complete it, and unable to leave until he does. What god Marika wanted killed, and why she wanted it killed, is left for the player to consider. One reading is that she meant the greater will, or its physical manifestation, the Elden Beast. Another is that she meant herself. Fact 65. Melina is one of the most mysterious characters in the game, and her origins are deliberately obscured. She acts as the player's guide and companion, offering her help in exchange for the player taking her to the Erdtree. She has one closed eye that she says she will open only at the end of the path. The lore suggests strong connections between Melina and Marika, to the point where many players read Melina as literally a piece of Marika's soul, sent out into the world after the Shattering to guide a Tarnished who might be capable of doing what needed to be done. Fact 66. Melina's alternative identity becomes relevant if players pursue the Frenzied Flame ending. If the player absorbs the Frenzied Flame, Melina leaves in visible anger, saying she will find a way to extinguish the Age of Chaos. The fact that she has an alternative response to this ending, one that involves her apparently acquiring the power of destined death, suggests that she has depths and resources that the game's main path does not fully reveal. Her final words in this alternate scenario imply a future confrontation that the game does not show. Fact 67. The Frenzied Flame, also called the One Great, is one of the more philosophically interesting elements of the game's cosmology. It is presented as the antithesis of the Elden Ring, described as the desire to undo all the separations that existence creates, to dissolve individual lives back into an undifferentiated whole. The Three Fingers, who grant access to this power, are described as a hidden entity below the subterranean shunning grounds. The Frenzied Flame ending, in which the player burns the Erdtree and the world with it, is presented as an absolute catastrophe by every other character in the game, but the game itself does not editorialize on whether it is truly worse than the alternatives. Fact 68. Hieta is the NPC associated with the Frenzied Flame questline in the most personal way. She is a young woman who appears to be blind, guided by the light of grapes that she eats. She is gradually moving toward the Three Fingers, drawn by a calling she cannot fully explain. Her questline ends with her becoming a Finger Maiden for the Three Fingers, a role that mirrors the Finger Maidens of the Two Fingers. The final iteration of her encountered deep below the earth is serene in a way that raises questions about whether the frenzied flame offers its followers a genuine peace or simply obliterates them before they can object. Fact 69. The underground regions of the game, Siofra River, Nokron, Ainsel River, and the Lake of Rot, represent an entire civilization that was displaced by the rise of the Erd Tree. The Silver Tears, the ancestral followers, and the ghostly remains of an ancient culture are all present down there. The lore suggests that the people who lived underground were driven below when the Erd Tree established its dominance, their connection to the surface severed. The eternal cities Nokron and Nokstella are the remnants of what they built in their exile. Fact 70. Nokron, the eternal city, was shattered when Radahn fell. This is one of the most geographically interesting details in the game. Radahn's hold on the stars prevented them from moving. When he was defeated, the stars moved again, and one of them fell on Nokron, destroying part of it and creating the crater through which players descend into the underground. The fact that this event was necessary for Ranni's questline, since it opened the path to a specific item she needed, suggests that Radahn's defeat was part of her plan all along, even if she did not arrange the Radahn festival herself. Fact 71. The ancestral followers are one of the underground's most interesting factions. They worship the Erd Tree's roots as they appear underground, decorating themselves with antlers and bone. Their faith appears to be a kind of reclaimed worship, taking the Erd Tree's symbolism and reimagining it in a way that fits their underground existence. Whether they are worshipping the Erd Tree as it is usually understood, or whether they have developed their own separate tradition that uses the Erd Tree as an image without fully belonging to the Golden Order, is left ambiguous. Fact 72. The Silver Tears are a species that lives in the underground and is capable of mimicking the form of other beings. They appear as silver liquid and can transform into copies of enemies or into humanoid forms. The lore suggests they were used in experiments connected to creating life, specifically the creation of a seam, an artificial being. The Silver Tears' mimicry ability is framed not as deception, but as a fundamental property of their biology, which makes them more interesting than simple shapeshifters. They are beings whose nature is transformation. Fact 73. The Mimic Tear boss, which players fight in Nokron, is a silver tear that has taken the form of the player character. Fighting your own reflection, dressed in your own armor, and using your own abilities is one of the more unsettling mechanical choices in the game. The lore context makes it stranger. The Silver Tear is not being malicious. It is doing what Silver Tears do. It encountered you and became you, not to destroy you, but because that is simply what it is. Fact 74. Ranni's questline involves retrieving the Fingerslayer blade from Nokron, a weapon specifically designed to harm or kill the two fingers. She then uses it to perform a ritual that separates her divine soul from the fate the two fingers had planned for her, allowing her to pursue her own path to godhood. The blade itself is one of the most significant items in the game from a lore perspective, representing the idea that the two fingers, and by extension the greater will, are not invulnerable. They can be hurt, they can be resisted. Fact 75. The Dark Moon, associated with Ranni, and the celestial body called the Dark Moon, represents her alternative order. The lore suggests that the Dark Moon is connected to a different cosmic power than the greater will, one that is colder, more distant, and less controlling. Ranni's ending involves using the Ring of the Dark Moon to establish a new age of stars, essentially replacing the greater will's influence over the lands between with a new order based on the star's own principles. Whether this is better or simply different is left for players to decide. Fact 76. Blad the Half-Wolf is Ranni's shadow, assigned to her by the two fingers, in the same way that Maliketh is Marika's shadow. He is devoted to Ranni and follows her quest willingly, but the lore reveals that he was created to be a failsafe. If Rani's plan ever endangered the Two Fingers agenda significantly enough, Blade was supposed to turn against her and stop her. He refuses to do this. He fights this compulsion and loses his mind in the process, ultimately going mad and attacking the player in the ruins below Rani's tower. It is one of the sadder character arcs in the game. Fact 77. E.g. the blacksmith, who lives near Rani's rise, is another of her devoted companions. He is a war counsellor who served Blad's master before Rani, and he has spent a long time in service of her goals. His fate is also grim. The lore implies that after Rani's departure, E.g. is killed, apparently by Black Knife assassins who were sent to clean up the connections to Rani's plan. The detail that he knew this was coming and stayed anyway says something about the loyalty that Rani inspires in people, even as she pursues a goal that involves her abandoning them. Fact 78. Preceptor. Seluvis is the most morally reprehensible character in Rani's questline, and possibly in the entire game. He presents himself as a devoted servant of Rani, but is actually pursuing his own project, which involves reducing people to puppets using a potion he developed. He has already done this to at least one person before you meet him. His questline offers players the opportunity to participate in this, and the game is unusually clear in how it presents this choice as straightforwardly awful. His fate when the questline concludes is completely unsurprising to anyone who paid attention to what kind of person he was. Fact 79. Selen the Graven Witch is one of the most complicated NPC arcs in the game from a lore perspective. She is a sorcerer who was expelled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria for pursuing research into the primeval current in a way the Academy found dangerous. The nature of her research, specifically the theory of the Graven schools and the creation of beings called Graven masses from accumulated souls, is genuinely disturbing. Her questline can end with her achieving her goal, which involves her fusing with a mass of souls in a way that she clearly chose, but that also looks like a kind of destruction of self. Fact 80. The Graven masses, giant spheres of screaming faces, are described in the lore as accumulated scholar souls. The Academy's scholars, after generations of sorcery study, apparently produced this phenomenon. The faces in the mass are still conscious, still aware, still in apparent distress. That the Academy produced this and then continued operating normally speaks to the kind of institutional detachment from ethical concerns that allowed its research to go wherever it went. Selen's project was trying to understand or control this phenomenon, though whether her final state is control or surrender is unclear. Fact 81. Thops is a very minor NPC, a young sorcerer sitting outside the Academy, who asks the player for a spare Academy glintstone key. His fate, if players do not give him a key, is simply that he dies at the church gate, never having gotten inside. If players do give him a key, he makes it into the Academy, learns what he wanted to learn, and also dies found as a corpse holding a bell bearing. His story is small and easily missed, but it illustrates something about the world of the game. There is no guarantee that effort and desire lead anywhere. The world is full of people who tried and failed. Fact 82. The Carian royal family, of which Renala is the head, has a specific tradition of moonlight sorcery that is distinct from the Academy's glintstone sorcery. The Carian tradition draws on lunar power, specifically the light of the full moon, and the swords of light associated with it appear throughout the game as weapons of both the royal family and the spectral knights who serve them. The Carian Manor in the north of Liurnia is essentially a monument to this tradition, and the story of Carian knights who have continued to patrol it long after the royal family's decline is one of the game's quieter tragedies. Fact 83. Loretta, the Knight of the Halig Tree, originally served the Carian royal family before following Miquella to the Halig Tree. Her boss appearance in the Carian Manor as a spirit, and then her second appearance as a full boss at the Halig Tree, traces the arc of a knight who genuinely believed in Michaela's project and gave everything she had to it. The fact that players have to kill her twice speaks to a devotion that continued even in death. Fact 84. The Erdtree Sentinel enemies that patrol the roads leading to the major sites of the lands between are described in the lore as apostles of the Elden Ring's light, warriors given the specific duty of guarding the paths of grace. They are not simply soldiers. They are part of the infrastructure of the current order, the physical manifestation of the Erdtree's protection of those who travel within its domain. The fact that they attack the player on sight rather than welcoming them as fellow tarnished seeking grace is a commentary on how the order perceives the tarnished. Fact 85. Millicent is one of the most beloved NPC storylines in the game. She's a young woman who carries a needle that Malenia herself fashioned, a talisman designed to suppress the scarlet rot within her. The lore strongly implies that Millicent is one of Malenia's daughters, created through some process related to the rot goddess's influence on Malenia. Her quest involves her gradually gaining the ability to use the power of the rot on her own terms, and her final choice, whether to remove the needle or keep it, reflects a question the game poses about whether one should embrace or resist the power that defines you. Fact 86. Gowry is the NPC who first sends players to help Millicent, asking them to repair her needle. His true nature, revealed through his questline, is that he is a servant of the Scarlet Rot, a devotee of the Rot goddess who has been guiding Millicent toward the destiny he believes the goddess wants for her. He is not malicious in the way that Seluvis is malicious. He genuinely believes in what he's doing. But his belief serves an agenda that is not Millicent's own, which places his apparently kind assistance in a very different light. Fact 87. Malenia's famous boss fight includes her Scarlet Ionia attack, in which she dies and then is reborn from a flower of rot that blooms from her body. This is not simply a dramatic boss mechanic. The lore frames it as connected to the rot goddess's cycle of bloom and death, the same cycle that Malenia's whole life has been embedded in. The rot consumes, the flower blooms, and life continues in a form saturated with scarlet. The attack's visual spectacle aside, it is one of the most lore-integrated boss mechanics in the game. Fact 88. The Flame of Frenzy has a specific origin in the world. It is described as the One Great, a concept connected to the idea of all things returning to their original unity. The lore suggests that the frenzied flame is not evil in an abstract sense, but is incompatible with the existence of individual consciousness and civilization. It wants everything to merge. Its followers, the flame monks and the evangelists who spread its teachings, are not standard cult villains. They are people who have found a genuine peace in the dissolution of self, which makes them strange and unsettling in a way that pure villainy would not be. Fact 89. The Mogwin dynasty's blood faith is connected to the Formless Mother, an outer god whose nature is described as associated with wounds and blood. The blood magic available in the game, the spells that use hemorrhage and blood loss, are technically gifts from this entity. Mohg's palace is soaked in blood, because that is how the Formless Mother's influence manifests physically. The colour and the visceral quality of the blood magic in the game are reflections of an outer god whose power is inseparable from suffering. Fact 90. The Crucible incantations, available to players who find the right scrolls and tomes, draw on the primordial power described in the early facts. They allow the caster to manifest crucible aspects on their own body, growing a tail for a sweeping attack, growing wings for a breath attack. These are not divine gifts in the Erdtree sense. They are connections to something older and raw, and the fact that the game makes them available reflects the game's general refusal to assign simple moral valence to different power sources. Fact 91. The Deathblight status effect is directly connected to Godwyn's condition. It is described as a kind of rot of the soul, and being killed by it results in the player's character dying in a way that looks like what happened to Godwin, white roots spreading across the body. The enemies that inflict death blight, primarily the basilisks and certain late-game entities, are all connected to the concept of the death of the soul. This status effect is one of the game's most mechanics-integrated pieces of lore. Fact 92. The remembrance system, which gives players items commemorating major bosses they have defeated, is itself a lore element. Remembrances are described as the echo of a powerful soul, a concentrated residue of the life and power of the being who was killed. The fact that you can either turn them into specific weapons and spells, or consume them for runes, reflects a choice between understanding and absorbing the power that defined another being, or simply converting it into raw currency for your own advancement. Fact 93. The grafted creatures throughout the game, particularly the grafted scions in the tutorial area, are described as creations assembled from many bodies. Their existence represents a particular kind of transgression against the Golden Order's conception of a natural body. Interestingly, Godric is not the only one engaged in grafting. It appears throughout the world in different forms, suggesting that the impulse to accumulate body parts as power is broader than one eccentric demigod's obsession. Fact 94. The jar people, those strange beings with jar-shaped heads and ceramic bodies, are described as beings constructed to contain warriors. The practice of placing the essence or spirit of a warrior inside a jar is described as a way of preserving that warrior. Alexander the Iron Fist is the most prominent jar character, and his quest involves him seeking to fill himself with the essence of great warriors to become the ultimate warrior jar. His arc ends with a fight against the player, which he requested because he wanted the experience of fighting a great tarnished before the end. Fact 95. The detail that the Albinaurics exist in two forms is important. The first generation of Albinaurics, the small white-haired people found in Liurnia, are described as failed attempts to create artificial life. They are gentle and fragile, and clearly aware that they are regarded as second-class beings by the world around them. The second generation, the taller wolf-head variety found later in the game, were created differently and have a different relationship to their own existence. Both groups have a connection to millennia and to the Silver Tears, and their lore involves questions about what it means to be created rather than born. Fact 96. Nephili Lu is a warrior, and the granddaughter of Gostok, the leering gatekeeper of Stormvale. But more relevantly, she is also the adopted daughter of Hora Lu, who later reveals himself as Godfrey. Her connection to the first Elden Lord is not biological, but it is still deeply personal, and her questline ends with the possibility of her becoming the ruler of Stormvale and serving as a lord whose power comes from legitimate strength rather than from grafted accumulation. Her story is one of the few in the game where things can end relatively well. Fact 97. Kenneth Haight is a minor lord who wants to reclaim Fort Haight and restore proper governance to the region east of Limgrave. His entire demeanour is pompous and entitled in a way that the game clearly finds amusing, but his goal is genuine. His questline intersects with Nephilis in a way that can result in a form of political stability, modest and undramatic compared to the cosmic stakes of the main quest, but real. It suggests that somewhere in the background of all this divine catastrophe, ordinary governance continues to matter. Fact 98. D. Hunter of the Dead is a tarnished who has devoted himself to destroying undead, specifically those who cling to life in defiance of what he sees as the natural order. His brother Devin is also present in the game, and their relationship illuminates something about how differently people can respond to the same circumstances. Dee's approach to the undead is pragmatic and cold. His story ends tragically, killed by fear in a confrontation that feels like a collision between two equally stubborn views of what is right. Fact 99. Fia, the deathbed companion, holds the dead in her embrace as a way of accumulating something called a baldachin blessing, which she can grant to others. Her presence at the round table hold is comforting and strange in equal measure. Her true purpose, pursued through her questline, is to give birth to a mending rune that would fix the Elden Ring in a specific way, allowing the dead to coexist with the living and potentially healing the wound left by the Knight of Black Knives. She is in love with Godwyn, or at least with the part of Godwyn that persists, and she descends into the underground to be with him at the end. Fact 100. The curse mark of death that Fia needs for her questline is found on the ghost of Ranni in the Divine Tower of Liurnia. This detail reinforces the connection between Ranni's Knight of Black Knives and the problem Fia is trying to solve. The curse mark represents the wound in the concept of death itself, the gap left when Godwyn's soul was killed but his body lived on. Fia's plan is not a cure exactly, it is an accommodation, a way of making a broken system somewhat functional again. Fact 101. The loathsome dung-eater is one of the game's most deliberately repulsive characters. He is a tarnished who has dedicated himself to defiling the dead, specifically because doing so seals them from the Erd tree's recycling system, condemning them to an existence that cannot end. His mending rune would rewrite the Elden Ring so that all future children born into the world would carry the Omen curse. His motivations are obscure, and he is not interested in explaining them coherently. What the game does with him is present a figure of pure negation, someone who has found meaning in destruction and defilement without any redemptive framework. Fact 102. Shabriri is the name associated with the will of the frenzied flame that inhabits the dung-eater's body. This is revealed in the questline connected to the frenzied flame ending. Shabriri is a historical figure, described as a man whose affliction of madness spread to others. The idea that the frenzied flame works through specific human vessels, using their worst impulses as a pathway into the world, is one of the more interesting aspects of its characterization. Fact 103. The Godskin Apostles and the Godskin Nobles are a religious order that predates the Golden Order and was devoted to slaying gods and wearing their skin. Their history is extraordinary. They operated in a world where gods were mortal enough to be killed by a dedicated group of mortal assassins. The fact that they were eventually suppressed by the Golden Order implies that the Golden Order saw their existence as threatening, which makes sense given that the Golden Order's power depended on the idea of divine authority being beyond challenge. Fact 104. The Godskin Noble Armor set and the Godskin Apostle Armor set both feature descriptions that speak to the Order's history and their specific roles. Nobles were the priests of the Order, the administrators of its doctrine. Apostles were the weapons, the ones who actually carried out the killings. Their combat styles in the game reflect this division. Nobles fight with a rolling, almost playful style that emphasizes endurance. Apostles fight with a grotesque stretching attack that expresses something about the nature of what they do. Fact 105. The black flame that the Godskin Order uses is described as the fire of a dead god, which dead god is not specified in the item descriptions, but the Glomide Queen is mentioned in connection with this power. She was a champion of the Godskin Order who apparently wielded this power directly, and she was destroyed by Malekith on Marika's orders. The black flame's ability to chip through health continuously, even after a hit lands, suggests a power that cannot be easily contained or dismissed once it has taken hold. Fact 106. The Glomide Queen is a figure who appears entirely in the background of the lore, never as an NPC or a spirit, never named directly in any visual element, but present in item descriptions as a ghost of what once was. She is described as someone who threatened the established order, who was destroyed before the current era of the game. Some researchers have connected her to theories about Marika's past, though the evidence for specific claims about her identity is limited. Fact 107. Volcano Manor's prisoner, NPC, Patches, is one of the game's recurring characters across multiple From Software titles. In Elden Ring, he appears as a treasure hunter and trap setter who repeatedly pushes the player into holes and ambushes them, then apologizes and eventually becomes a merchant. His self-aware commentary on his own behavior and the way he frames it as something he simply cannot help is funny, but there is a genuine thread of character consistency in his cowardice and his small-scale scheming that makes him more dimensional than his role would suggest. Fact 108. Tanith, the mistress of the Volcano Manor, is devoted to Rykard with an absolute loyalty that persists even after his death. After Rykard's boss fight, she can be found eating his remains. This is one of the game's most grotesque details, but in context it makes a strange kind of sense. She was devoted to someone who had merged with a serpent and was in the process of being consumed. Eating his remains is, from her perspective, a form of union with him. It is still horrifying, but it is horrifying in a way that is internally consistent with her character. Fact 109. The depraved perfumers are a faction encountered in the game's late areas, described as attendants who once served nobility but who have developed a religion around their perfume craft, believing that the right combination of scents can achieve divinity. Their obsession with smell and sensation as spiritual pathways is unusual in the game's broader context, and their hostility toward players who encounter them suggests they protect their doctrine jealously. Fact 110. The Erd Tree avatar enemies that guard the minor Erd Trees throughout the lands between are described as guardians of the minor sacred trees. The minor Erd Trees function as extensions of the main Erd Tree's influence, and the avatars suggest a kind of distributed awareness, as if the Erd Tree has appendages capable of acting independently. The fact that they become aggressive when approached is consistent with the Erd Tree functioning as a territorial entity, not simply a passive symbol of faith. Fact 111. The walking mausoleum structures scattered around the world, enormous stone buildings carried on the backs of stone giants, serve the specific function of allowing players to duplicate remembrances. But their lore description speaks to something more interesting. They were originally built to hold the bodies of important figures, allowing those figures to receive proper funerary rites while travelling. The fact that they now wander aimlessly through the lands between, without any clear destination or purpose, speaks to the breakdown of the order that would have given them direction. Fact 112. The bell bearings that players can give to the finger reader twins at the Round Table hold to expand merchant inventories were originally personal items carried by their owners. Each one has a specific description that says something about the person who carried it. The smithing master's bell bearings, for instance, indicate individuals who dedicated their lives to a specific craft. Bringing these items back to the twin maidens is framed as making use of the dead person's legacy, which is either practical or somewhat grim depending on how you look at it. Fact 113. The ghost glovewort and grave glovewort flowers used to upgrade spirit ashes are described as growing near the resting places of the dead. The lore implies they absorb something from the dead, a residue of the life that once inhabited the nearby body. Using this residue to strengthen spirit ashes, which are themselves the spiritual remains of once living beings, creates a chain of connection in which the dead nourish the dead. Fact 114. Spirit ashes themselves are described as the crystallized remnants of defeated warriors, condensed into a medium through which they can be summoned. The lone wolf ashes, one of the first sets of ashes many players receive, represent actual wolves that once lived and fought. The jellyfish ashes carry a note about a girl who was separated from her sister. Even the most utilitarian gameplay element in the game, a summonable companion, has a story embedded in it. Fact 115. The Knight's Cavalry armour, collected from the Knight's Cavalry bosses, describes the Order's founding as predating the Eerd tree and its members as servants of the death goddess. Their horses are described as phantom steeds of the after hours, which suggests these are not living animals, but something called into existence specifically for the Knights Cavalry's purpose. The fact that they dissolve at dawn connects them to a tradition of night and death that cannot persist into the day of the Erd tree's light. Fact 116. The Volcano Manor assassination targets include a list of figures with brief descriptions that together paint a picture of the political landscape of the lands between outside the demigod wars. These are people who have set themselves up as minor lords, enforcers of the Erd tree's doctrine in their regions, champions who believe in the old order. The fact that Rykard's followers are killing them is framed as blasphemy, but the descriptions of the targets themselves are rarely flattering. The game does not make it easy to decide who is right. Fact 117. Liurnia of the Lakes was flooded by the Mage War between the Carian royal family and the Academy of Raya Lucaria. The current landscape, where ruins jut from shallow water and the terrain is constantly waterlogged, was once dry land. The scale of the flood required to produce the current geography suggests a magical catastrophe of enormous proportions. The conflict between the Carians and the Academy, which ended in the Academy's dominance, left the entire region physically transformed. Fact 118. The Glintstone Dragon. Smaragd and other glintstone dragons in the game represent a different kind of dragon from the ancient dragons of Farum Azula. These dragons have absorbed glintstone energy, and their relationship with sorcery is more recent and more connected to the Academy's tradition. The distinction between the ancient dragons, who predate the current order, and the glintstone dragons, who are integrated into it, speaks to how the Eerd tree's expansion incorporated or transformed rather than simply destroyed things it encountered. Fact 119. The Dragon Communion Altar in Limgrave and the expanded version at the Cathedral of Dragon Communion in Caelid allow players to eat dragon hearts and acquire draconic incantations. The lore of these incantations describes the process of consuming a dragon's power as a kind of communion, an absorbing of something ancient and fundamental. The Dragon Scale Blade, the Graol's Roar spell, the Rotten Breath incantation, all of these represent a tradition of power transfer through literal consumption that predates and exists outside the Erd tree system. Fact 120. Elder Dragon. Graol is the largest dragon in the game, lying motionless in Caelid, with smaller dragons clustered around her. She does not attack. She simply exists, protected by her offspring, unable or unwilling to move. Killing her yields an enormous number of runes. The lore framing of this encounter is deliberately uncomfortable. She is not a threat. Killing her is purely an act of exploitation, and the game is aware of this framing. The small dragons around her become hostile when you attack her, not because they are monsters, but because something is attacking the being they are protecting. Fact 121. The death root that the Deathhawk Gurranq consumes is one of the more interesting ongoing plotlines in the game's background. Gurranq is a beast clergyman, a massive lion-headed warrior who is obsessed with consuming deathroot to purge it from the world. The lore reveals that Gurranq is actually Malekith, who has fractured his own identity to distance himself from the rune of death he carries. His growing aggression as you feed him more deathroot suggests that the power he is consuming is gradually overwhelming whatever identity he constructed to contain it. Fact 122. The Beast Clergyman boss fight, which transitions directly into the Malekith fight, is one of the most well-integrated lore moments in the game. As you fight Gurranq, he drops his staff and his prayer beads, and the fight suddenly becomes the Malekith fight. He is not transforming, he is reverting. The gentle, if unstable, Beast Clergyman is the constructed identity. The black blade is what was always underneath. The fight is the collapse of a psychological dam. Fact 123. The Star-Scourge great swords obtained from Radahn are described in terms that emphasize his gravity magic and his role in holding the stars in place. The dual nature of the weapons, one sword per hand, reflects Radahn's fighting style as a user of both conventional swordplay and gravity magic. The fact that these enormous weapons were used by a man riding a horse named Leonard, who was too small to carry his weight, and that Radahn learned gravity magic specifically so Leonard would not have to bear him, is one of the most unexpectedly humanizing details about an otherwise towering war figure. Fact 124. Leonard, Radahn's horse, has his own distinct description that the game includes in the item used to summon a ghost version of him. The attachment Radahn had to his horse, maintaining it through magic and continuing to ride it even as the horse became visibly too small for the task, is treated in the lore with complete seriousness. It is not a quirk or a joke. It is a demonstration of the kind of loyalty that defined Radahn's character, applied to someone too small to be impressive, but too important to be abandoned. Fact 125. The Star-Scourge Radahn boss fight, which takes place at the Radahn Festival, organised by Redmane Castle, is framed by the game as a festival of warriors gathered to fight Radahn and die gloriously in the attempt. Jeren, the festival's organiser, describes it as a mercy killing, since Radahn has been driven to madness by the Scarlet Rot. The warriors celebrating and dying to try to bring Radahn down is presented with genuine pathos. They are not simply fodder. They believe in what they're doing, and the game takes their belief seriously. Fact 126. Star-Scourge Radahn drops a remembrance that can be converted into either a gravity-pulling attack spell or his great swords. The gravity spell he drops references the concept of Radahn pulling the stars toward himself, the opposite of what he spent his life doing when he held them in place. This detail is quietly terrible. The final expression of his power, the one the player takes from his death, is a reflection of everything he was working against. Fact 127. The lands. Between itself is described in the game as a specific geographic and spiritual territory defined by the presence of the Erd Tree and the Elden Ring's influence. It is not simply a continent. It is a domain in a metaphysical sense, bounded not just by physical geography, but by the reach of the greater will's influence. The areas that exist outside this domain, like Farum Azula and the underground cities, are functionally different worlds with their own rules. Fact 128. The Round Table Hold NPC Dialos has one of the more grounded personal storylines in the game. He is a minor lord trying to find his servant Lanya, who has been killed by Volcano Manor assassins. His arc involves him eventually joining Volcano Manor himself, apparently in an attempt to understand why they killed her, or to take revenge from within, and it ends with him dying in the ruins of Jarburg, trying to protect the Jar folk who live there. His end is purposeless, in the traditional sense. He did not accomplish what he set out to do, but he died doing something that felt right to him in the moment. Fact 129. Jarburg itself is a small location that appears to be entirely populated by Jar people living peacefully. The only human character there is Dialos at the end of his questline, and Jar Ben, a small Jar child who wants to grow strong enough to protect his village. Jar Ben's questline, which involves inheriting the spirit of Alexander after his death, is one of the game's more optimistic moments. The strength of the greatest warrior Jar is not wasted. It is passed on to someone who wants to use it to protect, rather than to conquer. Fact 130. The twin bird kite shield description speaks to a tradition of the two birds associated with life and death, a complementary pair whose wings together represent the span of existence. This is one of many pieces of the game's broader cosmological vocabulary that appear in item descriptions without being formally explained elsewhere. The game is full of these fragments, individual details that point towards systems and histories that are never fully spelled out, trusting the player to construct meaning from the pieces. Fact 281. The shattering did not happen all at once. It was a process that unfolded over time, with different demigods entering conflict at different points and for different reasons. The initial outbreak of fighting was chaotic and driven by the immediate availability of the great runes after Marika shattered the ring. But as the shattering continued, it developed its own structure, with certain alliances and conflicts becoming more formalized. The world the player enters is not the immediate aftermath of the first clash. It is the residue of a long and complicated war that nobody won. Fact 282. The 7 great runes correspond to the 7 primary bearers among the demigods. Though not all demigods held runes, and not all bearers were pure demigods, Godric held his through inheritance from Godfrey's line. Renala's amber egg is not technically a great rune fragment, but functions similarly in the game system. This inconsistency is itself meaningful, suggesting that Renala's power over rebirth operates outside the normal framework of the Elden Ring's fragments, which is consistent with her amber egg having been given to her by Radagon, rather than derived from the shattering. Fact 283. The ancestral spirit bosses, specifically Ancestor Spirit and Regal Ancestor Spirit, are among the game's more cosmologically significant encounters outside the main plot. They are described as the spiritual manifestation of the ancient way of life that preceded the Erdtree's dominance. The ancestral followers worship them in the underground, and the ritual of lighting the flame statues to open the boss fog is a religious ceremony compressed into a gameplay mechanic. You are performing an actual rite to summon something genuinely sacred to the people who live here. Fact 284. The invisible graces, small golden embers that guide the player toward major objectives when players are lost, are described in the game's tutorial as manifestations of the Erdtree's light guiding tarnished toward their destiny. But the guidance is not explicit. It points in a direction, not to a specific goal. This is consistent with how divine guidance is presented throughout the game, directional and motivational, but never fully explanatory. The guidance tells you where to go, but not why or what you will find. Fact 285. The map fragments that players collect to fill in the world map are described as pieces of a map carved into stone pillars scattered throughout the lands between. The fact that someone carved these maps into stone, and the fact that they survived the shattering while so much else did not, suggests they were made deliberately durable, intended to persist through whatever catastrophe might come. Someone was preparing for the eventuality that the world's geography would need to be remembered. Fact 286. The bestial sanctum in Far Eastern Caelid houses Gurranq/Malekith, and is described as a sacred site of the beast clergyman tradition, predating the Golden Order. The route to the bestial sanctum, either through Caelid's dangerous terrain, or through a sending gate in the Third Church of Marika, reflects the sanctum's ambiguous status. It is accessible through divine infrastructure, the sending gate, but its contents are clearly not aligned with the Golden Order. The sending gate was either made before the beast tradition and the Golden Order diverged, or was made by someone who respected both. Fact 287. The Third Church of Marika, where the sending gate to the bestial sanctum is located, also contains a flask that gives players the Flask of Wondrous Physic. The church is in pristine condition compared to many similar sites in the game, and its contents suggest it was either maintained or simply not disturbed during the shattering period. The proximity of the sending gate to this preserved church creates an interesting suggestion about the relationship between Marika and the beast tradition that predates her. Fact 288. The 4 belfries of Liurnia contain portals to different locations in the game's past or parallel versions, specifically the Chapel of Anticipation, where players began the game, the Farum Azula before its fall, and the Nokron ruins. Accessing these portals requires imbued stone sword keys. The belfries themselves are described as structures that pierce the veil between states of existence, connecting the current world to its own past. The ability to revisit the opening area of the game through one of these portals gives players a direct visual comparison between where they started and where they are now. Fact 289. The Chapel of Anticipation, revisited through the Belfry portal, is where players first encountered the grafted scion that killed them in the tutorial. Returning to find the chapel intact, with the body of the player character's beginning visible at the bottom of the fall, and with the Stormhawk King now available to be collected from the nest where he was waiting, creates a quiet loop of beginning and continuation. The things that were there at the start are still there. The player is simply different now. Fact 290. The Night Comet's sorcery is described as a comet that strikes during the night when the sky is dark enough for its nature to be revealed. During the day, its trajectory would not be visible. Only darkness allows the comet to be seen for what it is. This is a small detail, but it connects the sorcery to the broader theme of things that are only visible when the dominant light source is absent. The Ur tree's golden day conceals things that the night reveals. Fact 291. The concept of the Empyrean is central to the game's politics. An Empyrean is a being who has the potential to become the next vessel of the Elden Ring, potentially replacing Marika. The candidates include Ranni, Malenia, and Miquella. Each of them responded to this potential destiny differently. Ranni fled it. Malenia was consumed by the rot goddess's competing claim. Miquella pursued it, but on his own terms. The fact that these three children of Marika, each of whom could have become the next god, each chose a path that led them away from the conventional succession, suggests something about Marika's children and what they inherited from her beyond her blood. Fact 292. The Deathbed Smalls item description reveals that Fia's tradition of deathbed companionship was practiced in a specific land where it was understood and valued. In the lands between, her practice is viewed with suspicion and discomfort, which explains why she's upfront about the fact that holding her will result in a minor debuff. She's accustomed to her practice being misunderstood. Her openness about the costs and her continued offer suggests someone who has learned not to conceal what they are, even when concealment would be easier. Fact 293. The mending rune of the Fell curse connected to the Dung Eater is described as a rune that would rewrite the fundamental nature of life in the lands between, so that all who are born bear the omen curse. This is not framed as revenge exactly, though that is one possible reading. Another reading is that the Dung Eater genuinely believes that a world where everyone is cursed is a more honest world than one where the curse is selectively applied to some. His nihilism has an internal logic, even if that logic leads somewhere catastrophic. Fact 294. The Radagon icon talisman, which quickens spellcasting, is described as being in the image of Radagon, who was noted for the speed and precision of his incantations. The talisman's function makes explicit the connection between Radagon's personal abilities and the divine qualities that made him an exceptional champion of the Erd Tree. Radagon was not simply a powerful figure in political terms. He was technically extraordinary, which is part of why his role as Marika's consort was so significant. Fact 295. The Carian Filigreed Crest Talisman, which reduces the FP cost of weapon arts, is described as a piece of Carian jewellery whose craftwork encodes specific sorcery principles. The description speaks to the Carian tradition of embedding magical properties in ornamentation, treating jewellery not as decoration but as functional magical apparatus. This detail enriches the visual language of the game, suggesting that the elaborate designs visible on Carian enemies and characters are not just aesthetic but operative. Fact 296. The Spelldrake Talisman, which provides magic resistance, is described as a scale from an old dragon embedded in a pendant. The scale's inherent magical properties, derived from a dragon's natural resistance to magic, have been channeled into a protective form. This is consistent with the game's treatment of draconic material as a primary resource for magical crafting. The physical remains of dragons carrying the metaphysical properties of the living dragon in concentrated form. Fact 297. The Longtail Cat Talisman, which prevents fall damage, is described as a good luck charm associated with cats who always land on their feet. The cats of the lands between, encountered as enemies in certain underground areas, have developed an almost mythological status for their agility and for the improbability of their survival in difficult environments. The talisman is a folkloric object, charming and functional in a way that contrasts with the massive cosmic significance of most of the game's other items. Fact 298. The wandering nobles throughout the lands between, the groups of hollowed human enemies in plain robes, are described as minor lords and retainers of various houses who have lost their connection to grace and descended into hollowness without ever achieving anything noteworthy. They are the anonymous casualties of the Shattering's collapse of the social order, people who were not important enough to be remembered as specific individuals, but who were once part of the fabric of a functioning world. Fact 299. The giant land octopuses of the coastal regions are described as creatures from the deep sea that have come ashore, drawn by the residue of rune energy that accumulates in certain areas. Their ability to vomit items suggests they have been consuming sources of rune energy from the sea floor and carrying them inland. They are not a threat in a military or cosmological sense. They are simply large animals doing what large animals do, moving toward food, in this case divine energy residue. Fact 300. The Star Caller Cry sorcery, which draws enemies toward a point using gravity, is described as the cry of a falling star, the sound made by a meteorite as it enters the atmosphere. The sorcery converts this atmospheric phenomenon into a gravitational pull. The description of a falling star as having a voice, and that voice being powerful enough to compel movement, connects the gravity magic tradition to a poetic understanding of celestial physics that treats stars as beings with expression rather than simply objects with mass. Fact 301. The fire giant's detailed ecology is worth examining. The giants who once roamed the mountain tops of the giants, before their near extermination, were a complete civilization, with their own fire god, their own funerary practices, and their own traditions of strength and combat. The items found in the mountaintops region, including the smithing stones and the giants' architectural remnants, suggest they were not simply large hostile creatures, but a developed people who happened to be on the wrong side of Marika's expansion. Fact 302. The smithing stone deposits found throughout the mountaintops of the giants are described in terms that connect them to the ancient dragon tradition, as noted earlier. The fact that they are concentrated in the giants' territory suggests that the giants either had access to significant draconic remains in their region, or that the same geological processes that deposited dragon remains also deposited them near the giants' homeland. The giants' connection to fire and to ancient power sources predates their conflict with Marika. Fact 303. Commander Niall's ghost soldiers, the spirits he summons during his boss fight, are described as warriors who fell in the battles of the Shattering period that he commanded. He carries their memory and their loyalty beyond their deaths, and they answer his call. This is different from spirit summoning as players do it. Niall's soldiers come because of the bond formed in life, a loyalty that outlasted their physical existence. The distinction between memory-preserved spirits and the more formal spirit ash system reflects different relationships to death. Fact 304. The Alabaster Lord Enemies found in specific locations are described as servants of a star-based tradition, beings who fell from the sky and have been adjusting to the earth ever since. Their gravity magic and their general demeanour suggest they are visitors from outside the world, not long established in the lands between, but recently arrived and still oriented toward the sky from which they came. Their connection to the falling stars that are associated with Radon and the gravity magic tradition positions them as connected to the same cosmic events. Fact 305. The Astal natural born of the Void Boss is described as a being of the void born from the stars who fell into the underground, specifically into the Lake of Rot area in some ancient event. Its horrifying alien appearance, a massive constellation of connected body parts that should not anatomically work, reflects its origin as something from outside the world's normal biology. It is not a creature that evolved in the lands between. It arrived from somewhere else and the world has not metabolized its presence. Fact 306. Astal, Stars of Darkness, the second Astal boss found in the DLC, is described as a variant that arrived more recently, possibly related to the star movements that Radon's death allowed. Its presence in the Land of Shadow reinforces the connection between the DLC's hidden region and cosmic events happening at the level of the stars. The Land of Shadow is not simply isolated from the lands between politically and geographically. It is connected to different cosmic currents. Fact 307. The Lake of Rot itself is described as an enormous underground accumulation of scarlet rot, possibly the largest single concentration of the substance in the world. Its proximity to Astel suggests either that Astel feeds on the rot or that Astel's presence contributed to the rot's accumulation. The Lake of Rot is also the route to the Grand Cloister, where Miquella's Haligtree's root system descends into the underground, creating an explicit spatial connection between the rot and the tree that was supposed to cure it. Fact 308. Malenia's presence at the top of the Haligtree is described in the game's NPC dialogue as her having returned to it after the battle with Radon. The Haligtree was supposed to be a refuge and a potential cure. Instead, it became the place she returned to after the most devastating expression of her condition, the battle that spread scarlet rot across an entire region. The Haligtree is simultaneously her home, her brother's greatest act of love, and a monument to the failure of that love to achieve what it intended. Fact 309. Malenia's second phase, in which she sheds her prosthetics and grows wings of rot, can be read as a transformation rather than simply an escalation. She is no longer trying to be the warrior contained within the armour. She is the rot goddess's vessel in full expression, human form, abandoned for something that reflects what she genuinely contains. Her face in this form is peaceful. She has stopped fighting what she is. Fact 310. The Great Jar NPCs who challenge players at the Colosseum sites by sending them against 3 consecutive PvP opponents represent a tradition of proving strength through combat. The Great Jar is described as a supreme warrior jar whose challenge is considered a genuine honour. Defeating all 3 of his summoned warriors and receiving the Arsenal charm from him is framed as a rite of passage. The game's most earnest tournament is run by a giant ceramic pot, and no one comments on how strange that is. Fact 311. The detailed lore of Rykard's serpent form includes descriptions of his voice coming from within the serpent's body rather than from a face. This reflects the merger being imperfect at the beginning. The human mind of Rykard, still recognisably itself, speaking from inside a serpent body that he chose, but that is gradually consuming him, creates a figure who is simultaneously triumphant and doomed. He got exactly what he wanted, and it is killing him in exactly the way he expected. Fact 312. The Volcano Manor's interior, with its unsettling mixture of formal dining and imprisoned strangers, is described in various NPC dialogues as having once been a place of genuine hospitality before Tanith repurposed it. The manor is built on the tradition of welcoming travellers, and this tradition has been inverted, welcoming travellers in order to recruit them for assassination work. The formal table settings and the polite conversation coexist with imprisonment and murder in a way that is deliberately jarring. Fact 313. The recusant finger item, used to invade other players' worlds in the service of Volcano Manor, is described as a relic of those who refuse the Erdtree's authority. The term recusant, with its connotation of principled refusal, is interesting. The Volcano Manor assassins are not simply criminals. They see themselves as principled objectors to an illegitimate order. This self-perception does not change what they do, but it gives them a coherent, internal framework that is more interesting than simple villainy. Fact 314. The rotten crystal sword, dropped by certain enemies in Caelid, combines the crystal technology of the Academy tradition with the scarlet rot of Caelid's environment. The weapon is described as having been affected by rot after its creation, changing its properties. The combination of two distinct harmful elements, the crystalline sharpness of glintstone-adjacent material and the biological horror of scarlet rot, creates something that is worse than either component alone. Fact 315. The Elden Ring soundtrack, composed by Yuka Kitamura, Tsukasa Saito, Yoshimi Otani, Shoi Miyazawa, and others, is worth noting in this context because several tracks use specific musical motifs that align with the game's lore factions. The theme associated with the Erdtree is bright and ascending. The theme associated with the frenzied flame is discordant and building. Malenia's theme has a fragility and a menace simultaneously. The music is another layer of lore communication, encoding character and meaning in sound. Fact 316. The frenzy flamestone crafting material, which inflicts madness build-up on items, is described as a fragment of the frenzied flame that has crystallized into a physical form stable enough to be carried and used. The idea that the frenzied flame can crystallize, can become a stable object rather than a burning force, is interesting. It suggests the frenzied flame has more structural integrity than its nature, as a force of dissolution would imply. Even the thing that wants to unmake everything takes physical form when concentrated. Fact 317. The ghost flame, the blue fire associated with death and cold, appears on enemies in the mountaintops of the Giants region and in certain underground areas. Its description connects it to the tradition of the death goddess, whose knights cavalry serve her. Ghost flame is not the Erdtree's sacred fire, not the frenzied flame, and not the fire of the ancient dragons. It is a fourth fire tradition, associated with night, death, and cold. The multiplicity of fire traditions in the game reflects how fundamental fire is as a metaphysical force, claimed by every major cosmic power in some form. Fact 318. The ice spear sorcery, which launches a mass of cold crystals, is described as a Carian sorcery that channels the destructive cold of the night sky. This connects it to the lunar tradition, with the cold of the night sky being an expression of the dark moon's influence, rather than simply weather. The Carian tradition's association with cold magic is thematically consistent with its lunar alignment. The moon provides a different kind of light than the sun, one that illuminates without warming, cold and clear. Fact 319. The Red Wolf of Radagon boss, encountered in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, is described as a spirit wolf that manifested from Radagon's own magical power. It protects the Academy not through political loyalty, but through a more primal connection to its creator. The description of it as being made of pure magical energy, shaped into a wolf, raises questions about the relationship between Radagon and this specific animal form. There is a reading that the wolf is not simply a creation, but a reflection of something in Radagon's own nature. Fact 320. The full-grown falling star beast at the top of Mount Gelmir, described earlier as having been embedded in the volcano for an extended period, is surrounded by evidence of past attempts to remove or contain it. The debris and the disrupted terrain around its location suggest that its presence has been a problem for the region for some time. Whatever it was originally doing when it fell, by this point it is simply stuck. A cosmic parasite that has become part of the landscape through sheer persistence. Fact 321. The Blood Oath armor set describes the rituals associated with Mohg's dynasty, specifically the oaths taken in blood that bind members of the dynasty to its lord. The imagery of blood oaths, promises sealed with physical substance, connects to the Formless Mother's theology of blood as a medium of significance. Blood in Mohg's tradition is not simply a biological substance, it is a covenant material, the substance through which lasting commitments are made and maintained. Fact 322. The marionette soldier enemies, articulated figures controlled by magical threads, are described as manufactured warriors produced by the Academy of Raya Lucaria. They represent the Academy's attempt to create a military force that does not require training living soldiers, substituting magically animated constructs for human fighters. Their presence throughout certain Academy-controlled areas reflects how seriously the Academy took its independence from the Golden Order and how thoroughly it prepared to defend that independence. Fact 323. The Avionette soldiers in the DLC are described as more advanced marionette variants created specifically for the Land of Shadows conditions. Their design, with their elongated limbs and their aerial combat capabilities, reflects adaptations made for fighting in a region with different terrain and different enemies than the Academy's home territory. The existence of these more specialized variants suggests the Academy's tradition of golem creation was exported and developed in the Land of Shadow. Fact 324. The Great Horn Hammer, associated with the Omen tradition, is described as a weapon made from the severed horns of Omen individuals. The fact that Omen horns are severed at birth as part of the Golden Order's customs means there is an ongoing supply of this material. A weapon made from the severed horns of outcast children, used by the Omen warriors who survived the sewers, carries an obvious symbolic weight. Their power is made literally from the evidence of their rejection. Fact 325. The Omen cleaver weapons are another example of the Omen's specific martial tradition. These are weapons adapted to the underground environment where the Omen live, designed for enclosed spaces and for the kind of violent survival the sewers require. The Omen's combat style, as expressed through these weapons, is not sophisticated in the Academy's sense. It is direct, heavy, and practical, the fighting style of people who learned to fight in a place where there was no room to be subtle. Fact 326. The depraved perfumer Trisha is a named NPC encountered in the late game who has developed her perfume practice to a degree that creates effects both harmful and genuinely useful. Her questline, such as it is, reflects the perfumer tradition's ambivalence about their own craft. They began as servants. They became independent practitioners with their own doctrine. Where the boundary falls between service and devotion for them is deliberately unclear. Fact 327. The entire region of mountaintops of the Giants is covered in a layer of snow that contains something other than ordinary cold. The ghost glovewort that grows there, the death root that appears, and the general atmosphere of death and age suggest that the region's cold is partly a metaphysical phenomenon, a residue of the events that happened there. The burning of the Erd Tree's protective seal at the peak, the activation of the Forge of the Giants, is supposed to be the culmination of the journey through this region of concentrated death and history. Fact 328. The Forge of the Giants, at the very peak of the mountaintops, was built specifically to burn the Erd Tree. This is where Marika directed Melina to bring the tarnished, the place where the fire of the giant's flame can be used to break the Erd Tree's seal and allow entry to the Erd Tree proper. The fact that this forge was built, presumably before the shattering when such a plan would have been Marika's to make, suggests that the ability to burn the Erd Tree was always part of the world's architecture. Marika, or someone with Marika's authority, prepared this place. Fact 329. Melina's sacrifice at the Forge of the Giants, where she uses herself as kindling to start the fire that burns the Erd Tree, is framed as a choice she made, rather than a compulsion. She could have refused to go to the forge. She could have refused the fire. Her decision to be the kindling reflects either an absolute commitment to the Tarnished's quest, a devotion to the goal, or something about her own nature that makes this sacrifice particularly significant. The fact that she disappears after this and only returns in the frenzied flame ending as an enemy suggests this was not simply a gameplay resource. Fact 330. The fire prelate enemies, large, heavily armoured figures carrying flaming weapons, are described as warriors who serve in the service of the fire giant tradition, maintaining the flame of the ancient giants in the current era. Their presence in multiple locations beyond the giant's homeland suggests that the fire giant tradition had adherents and extensions outside the main territory, people who maintained the old flame practices, even in regions where the giants themselves were gone. Fact 331. The Volcano Manor assassination quest target Juno Hoslow, Knight of Blood, is described in terms that connect him to both the Hoslow family and to the Blood Knight tradition adjacent to Mog's domain. His characterization as a knight devoted to blood suggests that the Lord of Blood's influence extended through informal adherents as well as formal dynasty members, creating a network of blood-affiliated warriors throughout the lands between. Fact 332. The Church of the Plague. In the game's world is associated not with a specific faction, but with the general reality of disease and suffering in the lands between. The existence of a church that addresses plague directly, rather than treating it as divine punishment or simply as a physical problem, suggests a religious tradition that acknowledged suffering as a real phenomenon requiring a theological response. The specific tradition of this church is not fully elaborated, but its presence indicates a more compassionate strand of religious thought than the Golden Order typically represents. Fact 333. The Giant's Prayer Book contains incantations associated with the fire giant tradition. The fact that players can acquire this and learn the giant's sacred incantations is another example of the game allowing players to participate in every tradition it depicts, no matter how marginal or historically suppressed. The ability to cast giant fire prayers is also an implicit acknowledgement that the giant's faith was genuine, that their relationship with fire was sacred rather than simply destructive. Fact 334. The Spirit Spring jumps, updrafts that allow players to leap to otherwise inaccessible areas, are described as natural phenomena associated with the Spirit Spring flowers that grow near them. The flowers are said to be sacred to the ancestral traditions of certain peoples in the game's world. The fact that something as practical as a jump assist is embedded in a sacred natural phenomenon is consistent with the game's general approach of making almost every element of the world carry some layer of cultural meaning. Fact 335. The Crucible of the Lands Between is described in one reading as not simply an abstract cosmic principle, but as a geographical reality, a specific place or state toward which the Erd Tree's roots reach downward. The Erd Tree's roots dipping into the underground, into Nokron and the Lake of Rot, suggest that whatever the Crucible represents physically, it is below rather than above, in the depths of the earth rather than in the sky where the Erd Tree's canopy reaches. The Erd Tree is simultaneously reaching toward the cosmos above and drawing on the primordial below. Fact 336. The mushroom set armor items are associated with a tradition of practitioners who lived in underground fungal environments, developing both resistance to spores and a deep knowledge of the properties of different fungal materials. The aesthetic is deeply strange but internally consistent. Someone who spends their life in underground fungal ecosystems would develop exactly the practical knowledge represented by this set, and their armor would reflect their environment. Their existence represents the full breadth of the game's implied world beyond what players directly encounter. Fact 337. The Nox Mirror Helm is an armor piece associated with the Nox people, the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities underground. The mirror in their helmets is described as reflecting a specific kind of light, possibly related to the silver tradition or to the moonlight that filtered down to the underground in ancient times, when the cities were still connected to the surface. The Nox armor generally speaks to a civilization that adapted its traditions to an underground environment while maintaining connections to older, surface-based concepts. Fact 338. The Nox monk armor describes the religious practitioners of the underground civilization, those who maintain the Nox faith and practices in the absence of the sky and the Erdtree's light. Their faith appears to have been adapted from surface traditions, adjusted to the underground reality rather than abandoned. The persistence of religious practice in complete isolation from the usual environmental triggers of that practice reflects something fundamental about how communities maintain identity under pressure. Fact 339. The ghostly glintstone shard sorcery is described as a sorcery that captures and weaponizes the residual energy of deceased sorcerers. The ghost glintstone phenomenon, where the energy of dead magic users persists and can be directed, speaks to the idea that sorcerous knowledge is not fully lost when a sorcerer dies. It transforms, becomes less organized, but the energy itself persists and can be accessed by those who know how. Fact 340. The Helfen Steeple Greatsword, a ghost flame weapon, is described as the steeple of a church that was carried off by the deathbirds to the land of death. The image of architectural elements, specifically church steeples, being carried away by deathbirds to another realm, suggests that the death goddess tradition was not simply about individual souls. It was about places as well, entire sacred sites being taken to whatever land she governed. The weapon is a piece of that architecture, now a weapon in the physical world. Fact 341. The Magma Blade, a weapon associated with the serpent worshippers and the volcanic tradition, is described as having been forged in the magma of Mount Gelmir, specifically so that it retains heat and can coat its attacks with molten rock. This is not magical fire added to an ordinary blade. The blade is made of material that is still at least partially molten, a material science achievement that combines volcanic geology and weaponcraft in a way that is only possible in this specific region. The weapon's lore is its origin, and its origin is its function. Fact 342. The magma worm bosses throughout the game are described as serpents that have absorbed volcanic energy to the point where their bodies produce magma. They are different from the true ancient serpents associated with Rykard's tradition, being more animalistic and less ancient. But their distribution through volcanic areas suggests they are a natural phenomenon of the lands between's geology, life forms that adapted to extreme heat rather than beings created with any specific purpose. Fact 343. The stone sword keys, used to access sealed areas and specific optional content, are described as keys carved from ancient stone that can dissolve specific magical seals. The fact that they are consumable means that using one is permanent, a point of no return for accessing whatever is behind the seal. The lore of the stone sword keys implies that the seals they open were placed deliberately by someone who wanted those areas accessible only to those willing to spend a specific resource. The seals are gatekeeping tools, and the keys represent commitment. Fact 344. The sealed passage beneath the academy, opened with an academy glintstone key, leads to the debate hall of the School of Graven Mages, which is directly connected to Sellen's research and to the Graven Mass phenomenon. The fact that this disturbing body of research is literally locked away beneath the academy, accessible but sealed, reflects the academy's complicated relationship with some of its own most transgressive work. They did not destroy it. They put it somewhere that required effort to reach. Fact 345. The Carian regal scepter, the stuff associated with Renala's royal tradition, describes the power of the full moon as something that Renala channeled directly in her prime. The scepter is described as still carrying traces of that power, the residue of what it amplified. Using it gives players access to the highest tier of lunar sorceries. The fact that her power, even diminished by grief and loss, can still be accessed through her staff speaks to the genuinely extraordinary nature of what Renala was before the shattering. Fact 346. The twinned set armour, associated with Dee and his brother Devin, describes a pair of twins who took completely different paths despite sharing the same origin. Dee became a hunter who sought to destroy the undead in the name of order. The lore of the twinned set captures this divergence, describing the armour as representing two halves of the same soul that grew in separate directions. The visual similarity of their armour contrasting with the complete divergence of their paths is one of the game's more elegantly simple character designs. Fact 347. The Nox flowing sword is described as a blade built from materials that allow it to flow and extend, like liquid, during certain attacks. The Nox tradition of weapons that behave like their environment, fluid and adaptive, reflects a civilization that had to work within tight spatial constraints, and therefore developed tools suited to those constraints. The weapon is strange from a surface perspective, but in the underground tunnels where it was developed, its extending properties would have been enormously practical. Fact 348. The Bolt of Gransax, described earlier as the giant bolt embedded in Lanedell, is accessible as a weapon in the game only from a specific ledge in the capital. Obtaining it requires platforming through the city in a way that specifically positions you alongside the scale of the weapon. Standing next to a bolt large enough to be a building is one of the game's more effective moments of environmental scale communication. Fact 349. The golden figure that can be seen through a fog gate in the late-game Lendell, visually resembling Marika, is deliberately left ambiguous. The game never confirms whether this is Marika herself, a ghost of her, or simply an environmental representation of her absence. The presence of this figure, in the otherwise devastated Ashen capital, suggests that Marika's connection to this place persists, even after her imprisonment within the Erd Tree. Fact 350. The Miquellan Knight's sword, described as a weapon given to a knight devoted to Miquella, has a description that speaks to the specific quality of devotion Miquella inspired. The sword is blessed with a holy light that is described as warm and compelling, almost impossible to resist once felt. This description is both an endorsement and a warning. The warmth of Miquella's blessing is genuinely comforting. That it is described as compelling rather than simply good points toward the DLC's more complex treatment of Miquella's power. Fact 351. The Sacred Relic sword, obtained from the Elden Beast's remembrance, is described as a weapon that channels the pure power of the Elden Ring itself. It is one of the most cosmologically significant weapons in the game, in lore terms. Using it in combat is using a fragment of the fundamental law of existence as a weapon. The weapon's design, a sword made of golden light, visually communicates this. It is not made of metal, but of the Elden Ring's own essence. Fact 352. The tree spear weapon is described as a spear made from a branch of the Erd tree itself. The Erd tree is not simply a tree, it is a living divine entity, and a branch from it is not wood in the ordinary sense. Using this as a spear means fighting with a piece of divine consciousness, a fragment of the greater will's physical presence in the world. Whether the Erd tree would approve of its branches being used as weapons is a question the game leaves open. Fact 353. The Elden Tree seal, connected to the Erd tree tradition, allows incantations from the highest tiers of Erd tree-aligned faith. Its description speaks to the seal as a direct conduit to the Erd tree's divine power, unmediated by any political institution. Where institutional faith requires the intermediary of the Church or the Golden Order's doctrine, the Elden Tree seal suggests a more direct connection, the sorcery equivalent of talking to the source rather than going through the official channels. Fact 354. The Taker's cameo talisman, which regenerates HP when enemies are killed nearby, is described as an artifact of the Formless Mother tradition, one that absorbs a fraction of the life force released when something dies nearby. This is an expression of the Formless Mother's theology applied to combat. The blood and the life force released in violence, feeding back into the fighter rather than dispersing. The talisman converts the ecology of combat, the death that surrounds the player, into a resource. Fact 355. The Crimson Seed talisman, which improves the healing potency of the red flask, is described as a seed from the Erd tree that carries concentrated golden grace. It is among the most straightforwardly useful talismans in the game, enhancing the most critical resource for survival. But its lore positions it as a fragment of divine favour made physical, a seed from the tree that sustains all life in the lands between, condensed into a form small enough to wear. Fact 356. The Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, which restores FP on backstab, is described as having been used by assassins who specialised in extended operations, needing to sustain their magical abilities across long periods without access to resource-restoring items. The design of the weapon reflects the specific operational needs of a particular kind of practitioner, and the weapon's continued existence as a functional tool suggests the tradition that created it was comprehensive in its preparation. Fact 357. The Reduvia dagger, obtained from Bloodyfinger Nereus in an early game invasion, is described as a weapon that continuously inflicts wounds that cannot heal, specifically that the blood loss from its attacks persists beyond the attack itself. The description of the wound as being cursed, the cut continuing to bleed regardless of normal healing, connects it to the blood magic tradition in a way that makes the weapon feel genuinely transgressive rather than simply mechanically effective. Fact 358. The Rotten Stray Ashes, summon ashes for a dog with scarlet rot properties, contain a description that speaks to the way the rot affects animals. The stray dogs that have been exposed to scarlet rot have had their biological systems altered in a way that makes them conduits for the rot without destroying them immediately.